This will be 200 Q&A. Ready? Begin. Alvin, would you state your name for the record, please? Alvin McGee. And where do you live? 59137 Griffin Street, Roswell. What's your occupation? I'm a farmer. How long have you been engaged in farming? Since 1976. Alvin, have you rented ground from the Marla Augustine Bryce Trust? Yes, I have. Do you recall when you first started renting that ground? 1990. At that time, who were you dealing with? My first contact was with Lee Bryce, who was the father of the people in the trust now, and Donald. But then after that, I dealt directly with Helena Bryce, who was the trustee of the trust at that time. So when you entered into the lease agreements with the trust initially, you dealt with Helena, correct? Did you have written leases? Yes, we did. Now, do you recall in general the first written lease that you had? Now, you don't have a copy of that, do you? No, I do not. So you're working from recollection here, correct? Do you remember what the rent on that first lease was? I don't specifically. I'm sure I could access it through old records, old bank records, or whatever. But no, right off the top of my head, I don't remember. Did that lease, if you recall, have a provision for an abatement of rent in the event of flooding? Yes, it did. Well, let's back up a little bit. Describe to the court, if you will, what land you rented from the Bryce Trust. I rent the southeast quarter of Section 17 in Clayton Township, which is in the same section as I live, and then I rent 200 acres in Section 23, also of Clayton Township, which is river bottom ground. I should rephrase that. It's not the full 200 acres. I rent the tillable portion of that 200 acres. So approximately how many tillable acres are we talking about? 300 more or less after the first lease that you had with the Bryce Trust, which had the flood abatement provision in there. Describe, if you will, what the flood abatement provision was. There was just a statement in the lease that in the event of flood on any given year covered under that lease, that we would renegotiate the rent for that year because of the obvious crop loss that we'd have or the prevention of farming it, planting it. And that lease was a cash rent lease. That's correct. So did there come a time then when that first lease terminated and you entered into a second lease with the Bryce Trust? Yes. And who did you deal with on that lease? That was also with Helena Bryce. And if you recall, did that lease have a provision for abatement for flood? No, it did not. Describe to the court, if you will, the flood situation on the ground and which ground that applies to. The ground in Section 23 is very near the river, and it's a lower piece of property. At the time that I rented it, it did not have any dikes on the Bryce Trust land proper. The flood control was dependent on the neighbors' dikes, and some were in disrepair. The first lease, we never had any floods happen, but in the 17 years that I've farmed it, it has flooded 7 of those 17 years. And as a result of those floods, did you ever lose your crop entirely? Sometimes. Sometimes I'd lose most of the crop. There are a couple areas on the farm that do not go underwater because once the water gets high enough, Highway 175 relieves the pressure and it runs west. And there's a couple small areas of the farm that are higher in elevation than the grade of Highway 175. So they would survive in the event of a flood. How many of those acres would you lose on a typical flood year? There really hasn't been a typical flood year. You know, we've lost all the way from 30 acres to 130 acres on a given year. And sometimes it's been more than once in a crop year. I see you've got some papers in your hand. What are those? I basically condensed all the information from my file that I've had on the Bryce Trust property for all the years into a smaller form that I can refer to easily. So are those papers to refresh your memory as to dates and events? That's correct. So now I think we're talking now about scratch that. The first lease agreement that you had with the Bryce Trust, you don't have a copy of? No, I do not. And then when that expired, you entered into another lease, correct? And again, who did you deal with at that time? That was with Helena Bryce. And was that also a written lease? Yes, it was. Do you recall what the rent was on that lease? No, I do not. I'm going to show you what's been marked as Plaintiff's Exhibit 5. Would you take a look at that? Okay. Do you recognize that document? Yes, I do. And what is it? This is a lease for the period of July 17, 1994 through March of 2000. Now, would that have been the second lease that you negotiated with Helena? Yes, yes, it is. Is that a true and accurate representation of that lease? Yes, it is. Taking a look at that document, Alvin, what was the rent payment during that period of time? $18,344 per year. What does that calculate out to per acre? Some over $60 an acre, approximately $60 an acre, a little over $60 an acre. All right, then did there come a time then when you, well, let me rephrase that. During the time that you were dealing with Helena Bryce as trustee of the trust, did you have any conversations with her about purchasing the property or being given an option on the property? No, I don't recall any conversations with Helena. Did there come a time then when you started dealing with someone else on the trust ground? Yes, the trust switched trustees and moved from Helena to Donald Bryce as the trustee. Do you recall when that occurred, when you started dealing with Donald on these matters? It would be sometime after I entered into a third lease on March 1 of 99. So it would be sometime after that, because we had a lease in place when they switched to having Donald being the trustee. Okay, I'm going to show you what's been marked Plaintiff's Exhibit number 1. Do you recognize that? Yes, this is a cash rent lease. And what period of time does that lease cover? March 1st, 1999 through February 28, 2005. And who did you negotiate that lease with? This was negotiated with Helena Bryce. With Helena, yes. But then shortly after that, you say that you then started dealing with Donald. That's correct. During the time you were dealing with Donald, did you have any conversations with him about purchasing the ground or getting an option on the ground? Yes, I did. Would you describe to the court how those conversations took place? I relate a previous experience that I'd had early in my farm career with a piece of ground that I had been farming, that I had a verbal promise that I could buy when it was for sale because it was an estate or going to be an estate situation. And that deal went south once the other heirs got involved. And I just told Donald that I didn't want that to happen again. And what was Donald's response? He agreed with me that it shouldn't happen again. So did you do anything about it at that time? We had several conversations about it, and with the improvements that I was doing to the property and paying for on the property, that were things that I couldn't take back, such as tile repair. And, well, let me interrupt. Let's talk about that a little bit. Did any of the lease agreements that you had with the Bryce Trust require you to make any improvements on the property? No, they did not. But did you, in fact, make improvements on the property? Yes, I did. And was Donald Bryce aware of the improvements that you were making? Yes, he was. Alvin, from the time that you started renting the ground, can you give the court an indication of what improvements you made? In the fall of 1997, I removed fence on the southeast quarter of Section 17 on two sides of the property bordering the road, and I hired Lee and Roland Bryce to help me with that. Do you have any idea what the cost of that improvement was? No, I don't. Okay, go ahead. Also, in the fall of 1997, we discovered a problem with the drainage tile that we had a contractor come in and fix. I helped the contractor in locating the tile and fixing the tile with my labor and my tractor. And then I also paid $2,000 in additional cash rent that year over and above what the lease required me to pay. How did you pay the $2,000 additional? How did you come about paying that? I just paid it in the form of extra cash rent rather than me getting to depreciate it. Tile is an asset that has to be depreciated on taxes, and when I paid the $2,000, it was just a direct expense for me. I can't depreciate tile on someone else's ground where the trust could. So was this actually paid in extra rent, or was this paid directly to the tile repair? No, this was paid in extra rent to the Bryce Trust. Did you have any written agreement to that effect? No, we did not. Now, at the time that you did this fence work and this tile work, was Donald Bryce aware that it was being done? Yes, he was. Did you discuss it with him? Yes, we did. And he agreed to that. Yes, he did, because they, in fact, had to pay part of the tile repair themselves, too. Then moving along, what other improvements have you made on the property? Also, in the fall of 97, I asked Donald's permission to clean out a ditch on the south side of that same property, a road ditch that had silted in that was restricting drainage. And I paid 100% of that to Eubanks Excavating. Okay. Fall of 1999, we repaired a dike on section 23, and this was done by Eubanks Excavating, and that was $1,795.20. And that was paid by you? Yes, it was. Did you ask Donald to pay for that, or what were your conversations with him about these improvements? They had installed a new dike on the east side of the property the year prior, and we got a high water year, and the dike was soft, and it blew out one area of the dike. The trust had spent money installing this original dike, which did not hold because it hadn't had time to get hard and set and all that, and we just got too much water for that to hold back. So then I paid for the second repair the following year to fix the dike that they had installed. Plus, we raised the dike by, I think, 2 feet because we determined it wasn't high enough originally. And Donald knew you were doing this work. Yes, he did. And he agreed to that. Yes, he did. Did you ask him to pay it, or did you just agree to pay it, or how did the money work? I didn't ask him to pay it, but Donald and I had, talked prior to that about me doing work on their farm that, once again, I couldn't take with me if I was no longer farming it. And he always assured me that they understood what I was doing and, would take that into consideration when and if they ever wanted to sell the land.